So when learning about equity, right, and you run into the maxim called equity regards substance over form, you start to look at things a little bit more because it's actually very important to see the distinction in between substance and form. Now both of these things here, substance, real things, and forms of it, ultimately represents still the labor of man, the encapsulation of time and energy invested in to these things here. So they have value. Now, these things here used to be backed up by substance back in the days, and it was backed up by gold and silver. You could take these things here in public, exchange them in public, but then you would take it to the bank, normally the national bank or some sort, or maybe a private bank, and then they give you some form of substance for it. But it's different right now. Take this to the bank, you'd only get credit. But credits is only given if somebody doesn't have anything. So if somebody has nothing to pay with or to give you anything, they can promise to give you something later on, and then you'll give them credits. Or if you don't have anything and you have to go ask, hey man, you think I can pay you next week, 2 weeks, and you can get credits. Credits is usually offered when you don't have anything to give other than a promise, right? So these things here actually are promises to pay. But who's the promise, or the one promising to pay here? And who's the one giving any value here? So if you notice this thing right here, this piece of paper, it has the governor, the financial secretary, and the director. These are persons of the bank, the central bank, and the government of Belize. So obviously this is an agreement between those two parties, those two persons, central bank, private bank, and the government of Belize. So the government of Belize has an agreement saying, hey, central bank, can you lend us some of these things right here? So the government borrows these things here and then lends them out to the public. And then those in public who borrow these things here use them, and then they have to pay something back, or to have to give something back. Because in equity, if you use somebody's property, that individual who has rights to that property can charge you an interest, charge you something for using its property, especially if you are making some form of profit from it. So these things here are borrowed from the government, issued to the and put out in public, and anyone using them will report that they used it. They will report that it came into their possession as an income, and then they used it. So then they would, if they're making any profit from it, then it would be regarded as, hey, that's a form of tax that you have to pay for that. Okay, so that's one way to look at it. So the tax is collected for the use of this piece of property that belongs to a private bank. Okay, but these are only promises to pay. So if this is a promise to pay and it gets deposited in a bank account or anywhere, in any accounts within Belize, there's already an agreement that an entity of Belize will put this in its account and add a little credit on its ledger, just by a promise to pay. But what is backing up this promise? Pay what? More of these promises? So if all we have are promises to pay, well, we'll always be in debt. So that's probably why the national debt is so high, because there's a lot of these floating around, right? But that's one way of looking at it. Not saying that's the only way to look at it, but what did the government have to give the bank for these in exchange? What value? Because the government don't have gold and silver reserves to back up their lending obligations or their borrowing obligations, what they borrow, sorry. So it used to be gold and silver, but what is it now? Well, usually you hear bonds. You hear them say, hey, government bonds and government bills are being sold, are being utilized, are being used to secure an obligation, to secure a loan, to secure a deal. Well, where are they getting these bonds? Well, they are contracts, right? They're contracts that evidence a promise to pay from people. So we the people, when we sign agreements, let's say a loan agreement or a security agreement, if it evidences a debt, and it can be interpreted as a promise to pay, right? Then it can be used to acquire credits, just like this, but in a different manner than this. This is already known as public legal tender. But there's public and private. Anything that happens in the public also happens in the private, but there are certain distinctions. So, in the private, when we sign a promissory note and we give it to the bank, and the bank accepts it, meaning it keeps it, and it doesn't give it back to us, it technically accepted it in its accounts and added credits, just as if we would have given him this. But that one takes a process. That takes processing time in the private. This one doesn't need to process. It's already understood as we're going to accept this as being okay to exchange in public to get credits, to generate credits in an account. But a promise to pay in a private, that goes into the ledger of the bank, and then that is kept as a credit, right? And then that's what's usually given to people when they ask for a loan. But what did they loan? Well, that's what a lot of people talk about. What did they loan? A lot of people say, oh, they don't loan anything. There's nothing to loan. I mean, you can't loan credits. Why are they loaning? Well, I mean, all that might be true, but if you're getting these and you're borrowing these, but with the agreement on the piece of paper that we sign, although it is a private agreement happening in the private, what is happening in the private is a promissory note is being issued in the private. The contract between those parties in the contract, those are public entities, and those are for public records. That in that contract, it is going to say who the promisor, who the payor is, and who the payee is, and there's sureties, all that. But that's going to be within the four corners of that contract. That is a public matter between public entities. Doesn't have to do with, that's forms of people, persons. That's between persons. But in the private, what happened is that privately in the back of the bank or somewhere in the office of the bank, a private agreement is a promissory note. It's handed over to the bank, and the bank says, we'll let you know if we'll keep the promissory note or not. If we keep it, we're going to treat it just like any other promissory note. Credits are going to be due upon that promissory note if accepted. So they keep the credit, they keep the promissory note, and get credits in the account. So why are they sending us a bill? Well, they're sending the public person a bill from the contract. They're acknowledging they're acknowledging the public agreement, the public obligation, but they're not acknowledging the private one because we're not bringing it up. Maybe we haven't mentioned it. And there's an assumption that there is no private agreement. But the private agreement is basically that you as a man or a woman conveyed as substance, conveyed a form of money to the bank, and you're promising to pay in that you're promising actually to guarantee the performance within that four corners of the contract. The only way you can fulfill that promise is that you're still alive by the time that contract is over. If you're still alive, that means your energy, your time and energy went into performing in the private, so that at the end of the contract you can adjust it using your equity. What is that? What does that mean, using your equity? Well, this and these represent real value, which is time and energy that we have, substance. When we give substance to this society, when we give substance to the government, to a corporation, they only give us forms. They never pay us. They give us promises. They don't have substance like we have substance to give. So therefore, they owe us. Why? Because we have invested in this our time and substance. So because we have substance invested in this, we have now a right to claim a benefit. Because what we're doing is we're the one giving the value in here. We are the ones giving. As soon as we claim it too, we're the one giving value. Our time and energy and the trust that we're putting into these entities right here that will perform also. Just like how I'm performing in the private, I am turning on the lights, buying gas, I'm consuming, I'm producing, I'm making this whole commercial engine run with my energy that I'm giving it. Just like all of you. But the substance that we have is vested in this form and in the forms that we sign as promissory notes. So that is why we can also always claim to have an equitable interest in those pieces of paper that contain our signature. However, if you read into equity laws or the courts of equity, you will see that they recognize form and substance, and they say equity regards form over substance. And they also say that there are two types of courts. There's courts of law and the courts of equity. And in the courts of law, they don't recognize equitable rights. In the courts of equity, they recognize rights, equitable rights, beneficial rights. But in the courts of law, they don't recognize beneficial rights, equitable titles. They don't really recognize those things as they should. That's why they have the equity courts. Because see, the courts of law is all commercial. So there are a lot of presumptions. So equity doesn't really look at the form. Equity looks at the substance of the matter. Substance. That's why we bring things in equity. Now, equity operates in personam. What the heck is that? What does that mean? Well, you see, in the courts of law, if you can acquire rights to property, you control that property. You can take that property and put it somewhere. You can even lock that property up. So you see a lot of people go to courts and their bodies get locked up, right? Well, that's because the body is being considered to be property, and somebody who has an interest, claiming to have an interest in that piece of property, is not only allowing but enforcing that property to be put in a storage somewhere, right? Called prison or whatnot. So rights to property in the public is very Rights to property in the public, or interest in rights, is something that is presumed that the government has above all. That's the presumption. The government has sole property rights over the people. It's not so, but it's because we all are grown to believe that. But what they have rights to is the birth certificate. That's what they have rights to. The form which represents the substance. The form, the birth certificate, was issued by the government. They created, they printed it,